So excited to be here. It's always a thrill when Mark and team give me a call. So super excited to be in person this year. I believe last year you were virtual, so It's nice to physically get to have this conversation, and I think we'll only bring more richness. We will save time for Q&A at the end of this conversation, so definitely be preparing any questions that may be on your mind, kind of specific to this intersection of the LGBTQ plus community and faith communities. For way of introduction, Jane Barry-Moran, I use she, her pronouns. As was introduced, I'm Managing Director of Research Programs and Member Experience at Out Leadership. I like to say I'm shopping for a shorter title, so any ideas are certainly welcome. Been with the organization for 4 years, but before that I worked in religious higher education, really at that intersection of how do we integrate DEI into religious institutions. And so it's always fun to put that hat back on when the phone rings from Mark and team. So thrilled to be here, obviously also bringing in the LGBTQ element specific to the workplace from Out Leadership. So I see some familiar faces from my work at Out Leadership, so it's always nice to be kind of recentering on this conversation. I would love to pass it to you, Gurchaten, to just tell a little bit about your work and your background to get us started.
Perfect. So thank you very much, Jane, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a lot more easier to do this on Zoom. It's very nerve-wracking to do this in front of a room of live people, so please bear with me. So I'm Gurchaten, pronounced like Manhattan. Never thought I'd be saying that whilst I'm actually here. I also go by Nanu, they, he, Director of Programs at ILGA, or ILGA World. ILGA is the International Lesbian, Gay, Bi, Trans and Intersex Association. We are the largest global federation made up of 2,000 member organizations from over 170 countries. Now been at ILGA, I luckily have a shorter title, so Director of Programs. Been at ILGA now for just over 2 years, coming into my 3rd year. Prior to that, I was at the International Labour Organization, which is a specialized UN agency working on non-discrimination and equal pay for work of equal value, specifically working on the intersections of race, religion, and sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation with you, Jay.
I was telling Gurchaten that when I get nervous walking up, which I do every time, I just remember that you have no idea what we were going to say. So there's no reason to be nervous. Let's start with, we want to really frame this conversation starting with the personal, our own experiences at this intersection, and then bringing in both our work professionally and kind of specifically the workplace. And so that's how we'll structure this conversation. So, I think that it would be important for folks to know from both of us kind of that specific experience of the conflict experienced between being a part of the LGBTQ plus community and being a person of faith. Can you speak to that a little bit in your own experience?
Sure. How long have you got?
39 minutes, yeah.
So, okay, we haven't got all day for this, so I'll try and keep it brief. Look, let me start by saying, if you had told me 17 years ago, 18 years ago, I'd be sitting in this room talking about this intersection of faith and sexuality and being a person of queer identity and faith, I would have said, no, you're lying. I would never be doing that. No, because I think 17 years ago, I think I was so closeted that even the word to admit to myself being identifying as queer or as gay at the time was a very, very big challenge. So just a bit of background. From my accent, you can see or tell that I was born in the UK. I have a very British hoity-toity accent. And, but I come from a family of Sikh migrant parents from North India, Punjab. So I grew up in the 80s, yes, I'm that old, when there was homophobia was rife in the UK, as well as racism. So my first experience wasn't of homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia. That didn't happen. My first experience was of racism. Growing up in the UK in the 1980s, there was a lot of xenophobia, there was a lot of racism. I can recall my father being, telling me stories of being chased by what was then the British National Party or the National Front, our equivalent of the KKK in the UK. And actually BNP is actually a political party, believe it or not. And being chased by fascist thugs just to have his turban ripped off and that of his friend. So this was our experience, and the experience was often, you know, being told to go back to where I belong, and I wasn't quite, you know, I didn't quite belong in this space. The other part of this was not just that, but growing up in a multicultural community was, and as a first generation, you did not quite fit in. And my struggle constantly throughout life was, up until a certain point, was around where do I belong and who am I? So I was always hearing this sort of, I was always struggling with this idea, am I British or am I Indian? Am I brown enough for my brown friends? Am I white enough for my white friends? And I would often also hear this, am I male enough or masculine enough to hang out with boys? Because growing up in these two different, what would be seen as opposing cultures, by day I would go to school in a British culture and British environment, come home and speak Punjabi in an Indian environment. And the two worlds would often clash with one another and not, you know, be welcoming. And one thing that they did agree on was that queer people could not exist. And this is in the 80s when we had the backset of the HIV and AIDS pandemic. And boys had to be boys. And so I would constantly hear this, you know, you're not masculine enough. Oh, my parents, you know, members of the community would say, oh, you should have been the girl and your sister should have been the boy. As to say, you know, one, you know, to be a girl is wrong. And two, I was not, you know, and being feminine or effeminate was also wrong. So this kind of struggle always existed into my life. And I think even growing up, it was like, well, can I be, then coming into my faith, can I be Sikh and be queer as well? So this idea of just belonging in this was not, I was just not okay with it. I always did not want to be brown. I wanted to be white. I didn't want to be of faith, blue-eyed, you know, blonde-haired and of a different community. This wasn't just the body I wanted to be in. So there was always this sort of struggle of trying to fit in. And I thought, and the challenge in the UK was, you know, trying to explore parts of your sexuality were very challenging as well. We're a very tight-knit community. And so you look over your shoulder and you know someone, right? And I can give you an example where during one day I was walking down the street with a friend of mine, arm in arm, girl, and then the next evening I get a call. We saw your son walking around town, had a woman in his arm. Who is she? What's going on? So this is the kind of security, this is the kind of, you know, tight-knit environment I was growing up. So I felt that this other part of me that kept very hidden, I just could not explore until I moved to Geneva, Switzerland, where I felt, oh, okay, a bit of space here. There's something that I need to find out about myself. And whilst I was doing that in my personal life, in my private life, in my professional life, within weeks of joining the ILO, and you think the UN, of all places, very inclusive, safe, I was told, well, if you come out, you know, don't come out here, it's not safe, you won't get a contract, it won't be extended. As you know, in the UN system, it's quite, I wouldn't say precarious, but it's contract to contract. So this kind of pushed me way back into that closet and sort of, and whilst I was okay with being gay or queer outside of work, I wasn't okay with that. So names would be changed. I would have to cover up, often lie about where I was, what I was doing, who we were with. And he'd hear colleagues saying to me, you know, oh, Nanu, you know, you're going to make a lovely husband one day. That woman's going to be very lucky. And I'd sort of nervously laugh it off. Until one day a partner of mine then told me, look, you seem to be okay with the idea of being gay, but you're not really, right? And then I would sort of brush it off. I'm like, of course I'm fine with it. Because no, you need support. You need to go and speak to someone about this. No. I was like, there was a constant wall in front of me. No, I don't. I'm fine. I'm okay with where I am. And to sort of add to that, it wasn't until I sort of admitted to myself, actually, no, there is something wrong. Because I come from a culture where you deal with your own problems. You're man enough, right? You sort yourself out. Finally admitted to myself that actually, no, I needed to speak to someone and started going through counselling. And that journey helped me come to where I was actually realised, well, actually, no, I need to come out. I need to sort of not come out to work, but also come out to myself. this is a part of my life that I can't keep hidden. And that's when I started working on UN Globe. And actually, working on UN Globe, I learned more about sexual orientation and gender identity and sex characteristics and the whole gamut of our community. And it actually brought me closer back to my faith. And on a spiritual journey that actually, this idea of pluralities in our pluralism, I think that was mentioned in a previous conversation, that it can coexist because you're constantly told you have to be this or you have to be that, but you can't be both. And that brought me to the idea, yes, actually. And there was this, we write about it in textbooks, we've got these theories, you can have these more, but actually living through it and actually going into that journey yourself is so much powerful. You're like, actually, I can be British and I can be Indian. I can have masculinity and femininity coexisting, right? And this is on my terms. I can be queer and I can be of faith as well. And that was a powerful journey for me because you do the work yourself. And that's why it's so important to, I think, start with the self first before. And often what we see in our spaces, a lot of people are actually coming into this work and they're not coming in it from having done their homework and worked on their own selves first. It's often trauma-driven. It's often, falsely informed. I think the other part was someone saying in the previous panel, May was saying everyone became a D&I expert. Did see that happening. As soon as you attended an unconscious bias training, someone said, oh, I'm a D&I expert. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And right, and the true experts are the ones saying, no, I still have things to learn.
Yeah.
I think is a big piece of that. And I think we'll get to this in our conversation, but for me, hearing your story again, is this what you all were talking about on this last panel is difference, but then also commonalities. So obviously, white woman from the US, Christian, lesbian, and yet all of those differences from your story, and yet so much in common in terms of the strands around covering, around kind of trying to fit into the box that my community growing up wanted me to be in. So growing up in a very Irish Catholic household, community, very involved in our church. My grandpa was a deacon, my great uncle was a Catholic priest. So there was no space for anything other than being, someday a wife and a mother, which I am, a bit of a different picture than perhaps what they were picturing at the time, but is kind of how do we break away from these concepts of covering, whether it be covering as a LGBTQ individual in certain spaces. For me, it was coming into Catholic higher education and having to make that decision of, will I be out and what will that look like? And for me, I chose to be out even in my first jobs, but then having to deal with the pushback of uncomfortable conversations and uncomfortable biases that there was no shyness in feeling confronted by. And so I think that what we talked a lot about in our previous conversations, and I think what's really valuable probably for this group, is the reality that the LGBTQ plus community can be a very difficult place to be a person of faith, and faith communities can be a very difficult place to be an out LGBTQ plus person. And so when we think about that conflict, what are some of the initial bridges that need to be built to move away from that tension? We certainly are not going to solve that in 29 minutes, but what are some of the things that come to mind for you at first when we think about that conflict?
That's a really important question, because I think if we can solve this, I think we're on a winner here, because this is where some of the crux of the problems lie, and I think the workplace has a key role to play in this. So, like you said, Jane, it's the challenge is right now is we see our communities sort of dealing with years and years of trauma, violence committed against our bodies, against us and our identities, in the name of faith and in the name of religion, right? And we have to understand where that's coming from. So, that's the first part, is the understanding, the listening as well. On the flip side of that is making sure that the people in the room have done their homework as well. That our members of our community are coming into this space. Yes, they're going to be angry. Yes, they're going to be upset and hurt, but they've also done the work and worked on that or worked on their individual stories, because if you bring that into the room and you haven't done that, the conversation's not going to be very fruitful, and it's not going to go anywhere. But of course, the key part of that is listening and understanding that pain. And what we're not seeing right now is that with the ERGs and with the ERG groups is this discussion happening. We're seeing it between, I think, women's ERGs and the LGBTI community, or family and LGBTI. Great. Are we seeing that discussions? And I'm sure you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen it happen yet. But with the faith-based ERGs and the LGBTI groups, are they coming together and having those conversations? Or are they like nervously, checking each other out in the corner of, in the room and going, oh, I want to talk to that person, but we're not ready yet. And of course, it's okay. Let's do that. Baby steps. We need to grow that organically. So a key part of that as well is where, not just inside the workplace, where workplace leaders, executives, CEOs, directors of companies can go out and take their message to governments and government policy as well. And what do I mean by that? Right now, we're seeing an attack on D&I, and our communities are held up as the key cause of that. Trans people, non-binary persons, LGBTI people, we're the cause of wokeism right now. We're the scapegoats. And as a consequence of that, all of this other work could be lost, right? And that's a shame. And I think this is where religious ERG groups need to stand up and say, right, actually, we're going to come to the support of our LGBTI colleagues and stand with them and have this discussion as well. So I think there's a lot of scope here to get uncomfortable, and I think this was something that was said in the last, again, a great quote was, are we ready to get uncomfortable? But not just as ERG groups, but as individuals as well. And we're not ready to do, I don't think we're always ready to do that. So, but there's another part here is bringing those, what we've seen in some businesses do as well, is bridging that conversation. We've seen, for example, one of our members, Open for Business, they helped, I don't know if, Open for Business helped facilitate a dialogue with the Vatican. They said, right, we're going to take our business leaders over across, and they met, I think, the number 2 or one of the highest cardinals there. They were supposed to meet with the Pope. Pope had other meetings, but they took in a group of business leaders as well as LGBTI leaders to have a conversation with the Vatican and the senior leadership there. That's where we've seen some of the dialogue and progress being made with the current leadership in the Vatican. However, are we seeing it? However, we're still seeing a pushback in other areas from that community, from the Catholic faith. But it's not just the Catholic faith, right? There's others as well. What I was very sad to see is from the ordained from our faith community, from Sikhs, was that the highest form of what our Vatican turned around and said, you know what, same-sex marriages, no, you can't do that. And our leaders just did not stand up. We have this group of people saying, push back, push back. So I think that helping that conversation happen is so critical for us right now.
Yeah, and I think that kind of to tap into what you were saying, I think it's this acknowledgement of past trauma, right? I think it's naive to think that to get to the table, to start those conversations, I think you have to take a step back and say, of course, folks from in the LGBTQ plus community, many of whom are closeted for longer because of their faith background or have experienced specific bigotry, specific othering from their community because of faith background. Of course, there needs to be that acknowledgement of trauma, of othering, to even start the conversation. Or from faith communities, kind of this hesitancy of, I want to go across this bridge and start this conversation, but I know that there's tension there. And so I think both are valid, and it's naive to think that it's just going to be this easy, immediate conversation where the ERGs are all of a sudden collaborating monthly and having all their cocktail hours together. I think that's naive, right? Yeah. But I think it's like, how do we start the conversation as this is uncomfortable? Maybe you have a roundtable, you have a conversation where you say, there are things that both communities need to hear from each other, and the acknowledgement of what I think folks think of as the unicorn, right? You and I, of folks who identify as part of both. That is much more common than I think people think. And so it's how do we enter these conversations with grace, but also with the acknowledgement that there is not going to be a necessarily linear path to collaboration. What does that look like, I guess?
I think I just want to go back to one key other point is often there's this tendency to think of us as one homogeneous group. We're not. We're a plurality of, I can never say that word, plurality of identities, right? And that exist within us as well and within our communities. And I think it's to look at key people within our communities to push certain agendas. Where can we see the biggest achievements? Now, at ILGA, we do a lot of work in the UN spaces. And one of the key allies one of the key achievements that we just seen recently a few months ago was our the first ever intersex resolution in the UN. And the unlikely ally that came up was Ghana and Pakistan, who are some of the strongest advocates pushing against our communities. But when it came to intersex rights, we wanted to support this. How do we? So on certain issues, who can go in and advocate for some spaces? We saw in the 60s and 70s, gay men, helped advance certain issues. We saw trans people advancing certain issues in other parts of the world as well. So I think it's not to see us as okay. We need to have everything done at the same time. But what issues can we advance on? What part of our community? And therefore, our communities, we need to perhaps step back on certain groups and certain issues. We always can't just come in with decrim and marriage equality.
Sure.
We have to come in with stop the violence, stop the hate, provide us with shelter, security. And that's the angle that I think works for us as well. And that's where it's critical for workplaces as well to move from that angle from, it's not just about marriage equality, it's not just about decrim, but it's about livelihoods, it's about safety, it's about security. And I think that's where workplaces have a key role to play as well.
And I'll just add, I think it's also this reflection inward as an LGBTQ plus community, something that is, I think part of getting across that bridge is the acknowledgement of the racism, the transphobia, the othering that happens within the LGBTQ plus community, the othering of people of faith backgrounds within our own community. I mean, I think that that journey of self-reflection as a community, because exactly what you said, we are a community that is every race, every religion, every background, folks with disabilities, veterans, all encompassed within the LGBTQ community. And so the tensions that are outside are, of course, within. And so it's that acknowledgement as well. Yeah,
definitely. We have again, holding up the mirror to our communities as well as other, we have this tendency to weaponize our identities and then start beating each other with them and saying, oh no, and then we also, tend to go into this whole idea of, I'm more of I'm more woke, or I'm more tuned into equality than you are, and this sort of competitiveness, or I'm more spiritual, or I'm more religious. It's always trying to one-up one another against, it's always this one-upmanship. Who is bigger, who is better? I think we need to stop that. And that stops with ourselves first, of course, as well as working within our communities as well. I think it goes back to that Karpman drama triangle, victim, savior, and victim, savior, and not the protagonist, but perpetuator. Yeah. So I think we need to get out of that drama triangle. We've got this obsession with it for some reason.
Yeah, I like that drama triangle. Get away. I do want to switch to Q&A for a bit. I do have one more question that I'll kind of close out the conversation with, but I would love to turn to you all. As you're forming your questions, I want to let you know I'm newly back from parental leave, and my last talk before parental leave was to a bunch of Canadian bankers at 9 a.m. on a Friday morning, and they asked excellent questions. So that's your bar, and so don't be disappointing me, okay? So let's see. I think we have mic runners.
Thank you, and thank you both so much. I really appreciate everything. I wondered if you could share a little bit about moving beyond programming-centered approaches. And what I mean by that is, especially with ERGs, it can be very easy to fall into activities and programs and things like that. And how do we make sure that it doesn't just become another thing to check off, another kind of tokenistic, not in that way, because it can be done very intentionally, but making sure that it's not just another thing to add to the calendar, but how, when we were hearing folks say that, you know, it's also individual transformation, it's individuals' learning paths and things that ERGs can support collectively and cultivate that sense of growth and development for folks, is how do we kind of move beyond not just another program to do, but cultivating that sense of community and growth?
Excellent question. Go ahead.
Oh, wow. I think you answered it somewhat yourself as well there. I think it's the questioning the intentionality of it. Why are we doing this? And if in that you don't find the answer, or you're finding that you're doing it for a checkbox exercise, then don't do it. And I think that's the key issue, is making sure that this is done from the intention that it's going to serve a long-term journey. One of the key things I've realized is that we're so eager to see equality now, right? We want to have this done now. We want to achieve it. We want to get this done. Indeed, we do. And there's a pressing issue for it, and there's a need for that. But I think it's these small endeavors or steps that we take are part of a bigger building block. I don't see equality as an end goal. And I think I see it as a continuous journey that we have to go on. So for us, I think for me, it's the intentionality around that, and allowing and creating space for organic dialogue to happen as well, and providing people the tool with the skill set, right? Those soft skills to have those very difficult conversations, and providing the space and time for that. How many of us in this room? I mean, I used to work so I was one of the presidents of the UN, the president of UN Globe, which is the UN's ERG on LGBTI rights, if you want to call it that. And a lot of this time that we were doing this work was done on our own time. So how are we carving out time that those who are leading this groups are doing this work, are doing it not on their own time, but doing it as part of their official duties as well, part of their performance analysis, yearly competence, whatever you want to call it, employee review cycles. It has to be embedded in that, and the space has to be created for that as well. So there's a sort of a genuine, organic interest to support that person as well.
Yeah, the thing I'll add actually was said in the previous conversation was this, and I think it was Joy, so sorry if I'm quoting the wrong person, but policies, practices, and mindset I'll quick do an exercise. Can everyone raise your hand if your organization or an organization you work with has done a program on mental health or self-care in the last 4 years?
Oh, wow.
Sure. So I go back to that example because when we're advising companies, when I'm having conversations with leaders, it's, do you have the policies, whether it be time that folks can take off for therapy or for self-care? Do you have wellness benefits? Do you have leaders who are modeling that they have a block on their calendar every Monday for therapy, or that they speak openly about making sure that you have that layer of self-care? I think you can't do authentic programming until you have those things to back it up, right? The model from leadership and the policies and practices to back it up. I think it's the same for this conversation, is do you have leaders modeling open conversation about this intersection? Do you have people telling stories about living at that intersection, or being parents of LGBTQ plus folks and people of faith? Those things need to be in place before you can jump in and have a panel or a program that's more people-centered. And I think that's where the authenticity comes up.
And I think just adding to that, the part of that is indeed it's the authenticity. It's also part of that is being visible. But going back to my former role when I was in the UN, I think one of the key challenges was having people who are who are LGBTIQ and of faith, but not visible and have a voice. And so hearing those voices in the shadows and getting those voices out, and that was one of our key programmatic areas as well, was, you know, we had people who are living in parts of the world and from those countries and communities where it could mean a death sentence, right? And you're asking them to come out and be visible without any security protection because they go home every single night and they don't have the same security what international staff have. So how do I, as a person, get to their voices and provide a space for them to be heard as well and listen to those issues as well? So I think it's really not just focusing on one part that can be vocal and you're hearing them, great, but what about the other parts of the communities that can't actually be outspoken and be visible and may not even want to trust the infrastructure that's already in place to share their thoughts? How are you going to get to those voices as well and encourage those voices to come out?
Absolutely. Great question. Thank you for that. Other questions? I see a hand up. Oh, and then...
Thank you, echoing Nina, for all that you are doing and what you've explained here. This work is hard and, of course, can be overwhelming and slow. So I'm curious what gives you hope?
You stole my last question, so how dare you? But we actually have to wrap up now. I'm too upset. No, go ahead.
Can we save that? Because I want to end with that. Because I think there's a lot, if that's okay with you? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. And Mark, I'll never do this again. So, no, I'm just I see a question right here. Yep.
Hi there, Edmund from Aramark and the DEI department. I really liked what you had mentioned around the different identities within the LGBTQ plus community kind of coming together, but also having individual interests or at certain points of time progressing in certain areas. Do you think that that is a model or an approach that we could see in interfaith ERGs within our organization, sort of coming together and advancing issues related to their specific identities, but doing it also as a community of interfaith? And if so, how would you begin that?
Oh, that's a really good question.
It's a whole panel unto itself.
I know. Wow, if I had the answer to that, I think you'd all be subcontracting my services right now. So, Mark, if you've got a vacancy going, I think the key part of that is actually allowing us to be human, right? And going back to the idea of that we make mistakes, we're going to get it wrong, and we're going to step up and own those mistakes and be accountable when we do get it wrong. So I think it's ensuring that everyone's coming into that space and having that dialogue and understanding the different perspectives. So that I'm talking about when we come in from an LGBTI perspective, you know. There's going to be different needs from a lesbian community. There's going to be different needs from a bisexual community. I mean, bi-erasure alone in our community is just, it's one of the biggest challenges that we're facing. How do we make sure that we're not erasing bi-identities because we suddenly, oh, that man's not really gay, he's, you know, or that man's wasn't, you know, straight, he was gay, but no, actually he was married, so couldn't he have been bi? You know, there's cases of that. So I think it's understanding that those initial conversations are going to be very, very challenging as well. And I think that kind of dialogue then going into the interfaith communities, making sure that people are coming in and understanding their different perspectives as well. I think the fact that there was an issue that was raised is what do we see in our common struggle and what is our common struggle as well? And identifying the struggle, not the people, not the institutions, because you're going to be battling and you're going to develop hate as well, but what is our struggle? What are we trying to achieve together? And I think that's one of the key parts of the interfaith dialogue for myself. I think bringing different people from those perspectives and saying, okay, what are we trying to achieve together? And then sort of bringing that dialogue. and bringing those two ERGs together to have that dialogue. But I think creating the spaces for that to happen are really, really key as well.
The only thing I'll add is a more practical piece that I have seen be successful in kind of being an initial bridge, which is conversations around partnership. So just making sure that when we're bringing ERGs together, when we're bringing communities together, something that can be a really helpful starting place is to make sure that as you're choosing community partners, you're picking ones that are inclusive on both sides. So not working with LGBTQ organizations that explicitly kind of other people of faith or have a history of racism or biphobia or transphobia, like doing your research to make sure that those organizations are inclusive unto themselves. And then the same from faith community partners is, are you picking community partners, organizations to collaborate with, obviously like the one that we're all here together today for, but also others as we think about like, are these organizations that have a history of donating funds to conversion therapy? Are these organizations that have a history of racism, of xenophobia themselves? And just kind of being collaborators with your ERG partners, I think can be a great way to say, I see you, I see your needs, and I understand that like we can help each other be better and continue to kind of along that journey in that way. So it can be a good kind of starting place for those conversations. And that's true for interfaith as well.
Yeah, I think one of the key, just as a concrete example, from our perspective, the government of Qatar were leading a resolution on Islamophobia in the UN. We never in the day of Sunday, think about partnering with the Qatari government, given their current stance on our communities. And I actually wanted to say, why don't we reach out and support this resolution against Islamophobia? Because yes, we need to stand up on this, and anti-Semitism. So I think that's the other side. It's not just waiting for it to come to you. How are you going to actually stand up and, actively show solidarity on certain issues when it comes to, and which are beyond our immediate needs as well? How are we stepping up for other people here?
Absolutely, yeah. We probably have time for one more question.
Come to the joy. Yeah.
Here you go.
Hello, and thank you. Nichelle with Saramount. So I wrote this question down to make sure I asked exactly what I want to ask. What recommendation could you give to DEI leaders or ERG program managers for how to effectively navigate conflicts that arise across these ERGs when legislation or the geopolitical climate reinforces polarization? I work with a lot of executive leaders that say we stay away from the interfaith space because we're afraid that the conflicts that come up are going to be so disruptive to our work. So what would you say to those leaders?
Again, another question that we could probably have a full conversation on. So put that on the agenda for next year. But I think it goes back to that commonality question and what is the purpose of DEI work in the first place, which is, I would hope for most organizations, is to have an organization to help us live by our values when it comes to talent, but then also to how we show up outside the walls of the organization. And so if that is the purpose, then unfortunately there is these uncomfortable moments where we have to revisit our values and then answer that question. And so even though there's hesitancy, it's reminding folks going back to what is best for our people and what is best for our clients. For-profit organizations, you have to care about what your clients are saying. It's part of what keeps all of your employees employed. But you also have to care about your talent. And so how do you use those mechanisms to remind leaders that they have to answer to those values? Certainly not easy conversations. Not everyone responds well to those conversations, but I think it's if you can go back to the purpose of DEI in the first place, which obviously is coming under attack, why the purpose is there. But I think most leaders at the end of the day, if you refocus the conversation on values and talent, that can be a starting place to at least have the conversation about what can be done. Not everyone's going to always sign on to statements. Not everyone's going to want to make conversation when it's these sensitive topics or topics that have historically been not discussed in the workplace, like faith or sexual orientation or gender identity, but I think more and more kind of that reorientation helps.
So I think from my side of things is that these problems are not going to go away. The reality of this is, sadly, whether we like, pushing it under the carpet is not going to make it go away. And I did, in my former role, brought up the issue of religion. We're not, it's one of the grounds protected under the ILO Convention 111. And yet one of the key things, one of my seniors has said, one of the key things that we don't discuss on at the dining table is religion and politics. So this is a very difficult issue. So even at the ILO, I can understand the challenges that you're having. The organization that's mandated to work on the world of work was finding it difficult to discuss the issues of religion. And yet, lo and behold, now where we find ourselves, given the issues that are going around in the world, the elephant in the room is the conflict right now, right? We are faced with that. And unfortunately, it's here right now. And turning a blind shoulder to it, it's not going to help. So, and it doesn't always have to be in a public domain, right? Those conversations can happen behind closed doors. Right now, our communities are under attack as LGBTI people. We know that, right? Trans and our siblings, and binary siblings are being attacked with legislation upon hate, with violence as well. Now, one of the key things that we've said was, look, how do we stop this? And it does mean going out and talking to the opposition. And we've said, what are we going to do to have that closed room discussion with those who are perpetuating hate, and have that difficult conversation, but in a framework as well. And it doesn't have to be in the public domain. And that's what gives us hope. The hope is that we can sit here continuously, day after day, and roll up our sleeves and have that dialogue and be prepared to have that dialogue and understand where other people are coming from as well. And understand the arguments that are being brought forward and understand their concerns. The issues around trans people and the sort of pushback on the harm that's being done to children. Well, actually, okay, let's talk about that. Let's have that difficult conversation, right? And keep the medical community out of this, right? Because they have a lot to account for us right now as well. Let's have a conversation about equality and fairness in sports. Let's have those difficult conversations as well. The other thing that gives me hope right now is that as much as they're very vocal and loud, it is a silent majority, right? There's figures in the UK that said that a lot of people I think above 70% support trans people and support non-binary people, right? So the data says something else, but we know that the very loud, silent, the loud minority are saying otherwise. So I think it's very, very key to sort of push back on that and be vocal, and if not equally as vocal, and keep on doing that work. And otherwise, it's recognizing those small victories that happen. And I think what was said actually struck a chord in my heart. We have to celebrate those momentary victories, and we have to have permanent vigilance. But that comes at a cost as well. Being permanently vigilant comes at a mental health cost. So what are we doing to support not just our people inside our communities, inside our workplace, but outside as well? So one of the key concerns for ILGA World is right now is, great, you're doing this great work inside your own organizations, but how are you supporting and enabling our communities to thrive outside of the workplace so that they can come into the workplace as well and support you? Because you, as leaders of your businesses, need enabling environments to thrive as well. And that cannot happen if our communities outside of the workplace are suffering. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is flashing at me, so I am going to wrap up. But I think what gives me hope is getting to have these types of conversations and then to have reflected back such thoughtful questions, to have leaders that are really doing the work, rolling up their sleeves to think about these types of intersections in ways that are, 10 years from now really going to make an impact. And I know on the other side of the table, it can feel very difficult and feel like that impact is very far away. And so, you all kind of keeping to it, that gives me a lot of hope, in addition to my 4-month-old daughter. So what are you going to do? We'll now watch a slideshow of her. No, I'm just kidding.